Welcome to today's Seidokan Saturday. Continuing with the bow. Now, it being Thanksgiving weekend, I didn't have a partner this weekend because the dojo's essentially closed. Happy Thanksgiving. Work off the turkey, ham, whatever. That's what I'm in the dojo for today. The bow, or the kun, has many iterations across cultures. In in England, Great Britain, Scotland, and those environs, it's known as the quarterstaff. In the military, they use what's known as a pugil stick. And in training, they'll have big pads on each end and wear the gloves, and combat ensues. All of these iterations are basically just variations of the stick. In quarterstaff fighting, however, there is a unique difference. In Okinawan, typically we have an over and under grip, and we work on manipulations of the bow and switching the hand positions accordingly so that we always have an over and under. Now there are some few kata in Okinawan, kobudo, in using the bow where you'll have a double overhand grip, but they're very few and far between. Typically, the double overhand grip allows for a certain type of and style of movement, where the over-under grip allows for a completely different type. The evolution of those fighting styles, or those uses of the bow, are based in the bladed weapons. Now I have here a practice naginata. The spear version of this would have the regular spear. And so when we're using a pointed weapon, that point stays forward, and this type of grip is much more amenable to striking, slashing, cutting with the blade end than to have a double overhand grip. Makes the fighting with the blade end a little more awkward. And so the evolution of the use of the bow in Oriental culture, both in Chinese with their long staff, as well as in Kung Fu, as well as in Kobudo, the evolution of the bow comes from the bladed weapons. In the quarterstaff usage, it didn't evolve from the bladed weapon, but rather from the shepherd's crook, or the walking stick. And so the use is quite different. Typically, you'll see the upper, lower, sideways blocking techniques in both sides, and striking from the double overhand grip, much more common in quarterstaff usage than in bow usage. And again, going back to the Chinese versions, typically they will take the very far end, because the entire concept of a weapon typically is to increase my reach. Now I will post below a link to another video of an individual talking about the ranges of fighting and how essentially all combat is the same on a conceptual level of we want to start as far away as we can using this weapon to get, and in Chinese it's very common to thrust all the way out and forward, and even in their staff usage, I don't have the flexible one, but they'll go down and use the entire range of the staff as opposed to the thirds. There are, even in tokumine, the two different types of stabbing movements that we use, even holding it in thirds, we extend forward with the stab, or we two-hand jab. But very rarely, again, it happens occasionally, will they use the entire length. In Yamani view, there's a lot more sliding of the hand along the weapon. And so a variety of methodologies emerge. Now, I still practice an old kata from the Kempo days, where it's used primarily in a quarterstaff grip. I'm not sure exactly of the history of that. I'd be curious if any of my Nick Serio, Sonny Gascon, Anyone in that lineage knows why we would use that in our Kempo form as opposed to the more, I don't want to say traditional, historically accurate, blade broke off and now we're in close. But in the video that I'm going to share, it shows some samurai tournament competitions where they go from the long range and then they get into the in-close engagement and actually down on the ground and then pulling a secondary bladed weapon, and it becomes much more realistic. But the concept is that as much as we want to start keeping the guy away, eventually it comes into close combat. We can send Scud missiles across the oceans, but eventually we get boots on the ground and somebody jumps into your foxhole. There's always that travel of distance to close, whether it's my kick distance, going to punch distance, going to elbow distance, going to grab all the way to the ground. There is that evolution. And if you imagine over the course of time that somebody in your school or in your military organization or in your dojo specialized in kicking, and they're really good at the long range, and so they went off on their own and they started teaching their specialty, and that evolved as an art. And then you have the guy in the dojo who's really good with his fists and fast hands and light on his feet, and so he goes off on his own and starts teaching. And so the evolution of the martial or fighting arts is kind of interesting when you look at it, and it's paralleled in modern times by, I always use the service station example. When I was growing up, as a lot of you may recall that are close to my age and older, you would pull into a service station where they had gas pumps. And a guy would come out and he would put the gas in your car, he'd open the hood, check your oil, check your fluids, check your tire pressure, all in the same place. Now we have Big O tires over here, and we have Midas muffler over there, and we have these guys who check your oil here, and they're all segmented and separated rather than being all one service center. The martial arts evolved the same way. So going back to the concept of the quarterstaff versus the bow or kun, as they evolved from the spear, if you look at that evolution, you can see how the ranges and the reach and into the throwing, as I was demonstrating last week and will continue next week, that it always goes from longer to shorter range. They evolved from whatever weapons or tools they had at hand, whether it was the shepherd's staff, the quarterstaff, or whether it was the military spear that then got into closer engagement. As you look at weapons forms and the fighting techniques derived from them, bear in mind always that historical context of both region and range, and when you combine those two, you can start to see how, a little bit more clearly, how the fighting techniques evolve. That's it, just wanted to put that out there for today. Thank you for joining, as always. Until next week, like, share, subscribe, do all the things, but most importantly, let's keep practicing.